Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Tom Woods Show, episode 2491. I'm delighted to be joined once again by my old Harvard professor, Vladimir Brokvin. I want to talk about issues relating to Ukraine this time, but I also want to remind everybody about Dr. Brovkin's new book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, Russia in Search of Its Identity, 1913 to 2023, which I highly recommend. We'll get more into that, no doubt, in future episodes. But welcome back, Dr. Brovkin.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Before we get into the questions I want to ask that pertain more closely to current events, I just want to refresh my memory. Do you have any recollection of whether or not you assigned to us Robert Conquest's book, Harvest of Sorrow, about the terror famine in Ukraine?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yes, I did. In fact, in those days, I wrote the review, and I knew Robert Conquest personally. He's a wonderful person. He's a great author, a great colleague. He's one of the best of that age. So yes, indeed.
But because I was a nerd, I had already read that book before I took your course, but I've recommended it ever since, even though I suppose perhaps with the opening of the Soviet archives, maybe there's a more thorough treatment that's been done since then.
Yeah, there are more details, but he got the big picture pretty much from the sources that he had. When I did research for this book, From Lenin to Putin, the terror and the 1930s was not my major focus. I just wanted to summarize major things, but I did discover some of the specifics. For example, in some of the letters to the Siberian Bureau, Stalin wrote about specific numbers of kulaks that had to be deported, and the Siberian Bureau wrote back that we cannot accept that many. He wanted several 100,000, and they wrote we can only handle 1 or 200,000. But in other words, what has come out since then is very, very specific figures that Russian historians in Russia are doing a great job of actually getting us the figures, the numbers day by day, month by month. So what we see here is a much more detailed picture than what Robert Conquest gave us. But in a general outline, I think his major contribution is to create this three stages: dekulakization, collectivization, terror, famine. And they're all three parts of a long process, which the Ukrainians call Holodomor. But that's only part of the picture. Ukraine is only part of the picture, but there's a bigger picture of the Stalin's war on peasantry and the so-called kulaks.
Well, as you say, even though some details may since have been filled in, I personally urge people to read Harvest of Sorrow because it is written in such an engaging way. It is not by any means a dry historical account. It reads like a novel. So it's everything he wrote was like that.
Yeah, Robert Conquest is a great writer. I mean, his command of English is spectacular. It's so rich and engaging. Yes, it's absolutely beautifully written book. Yes.
Now, shifting to the topic for today, obviously the West has taken great interest in Ukraine over the past couple of years because of the war. But related to the war, we've heard competing claims on both sides regarding the similarities or differences of the let's say the culture, the language, the history of Ukraine versus Russia, and the question of the historical boundaries of Ukraine as a nation state or as simply a cultural center. And of course, the Russian side says one thing and the Ukrainian side says another. And the reasonably educated Westerner has difficulty figuring out which side is closer to the truth. So can you help untangle that question?
Oh gosh, this is so complicated. I'll start with the Ukrainian treatment of it. The Ukrainians want to present the whole history that it is a history of Ukraine, and Russia is a kind of a derivative of the mainstream development from Kiev and Rus, from the ancient times, like 1,000 years ago, when there was just one state with a capital in Kiev, and that was called Kiev and Rus. and they focus and stay on that. So from that perspective, it was the Ukrainian or Kievan princess that was the princess was the Kievan one that was married to a French king. But what's wrong with this narrative is that there was no such concept Ukraine at that time. It didn't exist. It's like saying there was Texas at like 500 years before there was a Texas. There were some Indian tribes there, but it wasn't Texas. And the same thing here. There was this territory, which is where it is now, but it was not called Ukraine. The name Ukraine is Polish name, which means that these are the areas populated at the edges of Polish state, which was a big medieval Rich Pospolita, it was called. And it had the areas at the edge. And that's what the word Ukraine means, areas at the edge. Ukraina means at the edge. And these people were populated by Orthodox. And at that time, the division was not ethnic. There was no such thing as ethnic division. There were Catholics and there were Orthodox. The Orthodox ones were the ones who were later called people at the edge, which means Ukrainians. But it was not an ethnic, it was only a geographic definition. And in Tucker's interview, what Putin did, he showed to Tucker a letter by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who was the leader of the Cossacks, of the people of the edge, which means of the Ukrainians, or of Russian Cossacks, you want, Orthodox peasants. And in that letter, Khmelnytsky said to the Russian Tsar, please take us under your protection because we don't want to be under the Catholics. So, and that is sort of the beginning of what the Russians call reunification of the Ukraine with Russia, which the Poles say is a catastrophe when a part of Poland, which means a part of Rich Pospolita, was just went from one side to another. That's the origin of Ukraine. These are the territories in sort of north of Kiev today, which are the beginning of something that they call is modern Ukraine. That's the core of it. Now, during these Tsars times, which means in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, nobody called Ukraine Ukraine. It was only the name was a Polish name that was not in use. At that time, this territory was called Malorussia, which is translated as Small Russia. Now, I, in my lectures, always say this is not a correct translation because it sort of means there's a big Russia and there's a small Russia. A more appropriate translation, I think, is Core Russia. And the reason I think so is that I look at the old maps. I love to collect old maps. I have a whole collection of old maps. And in the old maps, I have one actually of printed at in the imprimerie of Napoleon I, Napoleon Bonaparte. And on that map, you have Petite Pologne, Grand Pologne, which means small Poland, big Poland, which should be translated as core Poland, big Poland. Same thing is Klein Deutschland, Groß Deutschland, core Germany, big Germany. And from that perspective, small Russia doesn't make sense. It's core Russia, whereas Kiev, which is where Russia started from, and then there's the Grand Russia. So from that point of view, Ukraine as a term was only revived by the Bolsheviks because they wanted to abolish everything the Tsar used, and they revived this term Ukraine. And then that's the origin of the term and of the Ukrainian state, and so on. Yeah.
Well, I guess I want to bring Robert Conquest back in for a minute because in Harvest of Sorrow, he makes the argument. Now, by the way, I'm going on memory here. It's been 30 years since I read that book, but he's claiming that or at least one of the motivations for the targeting of Ukraine was to crush the intelligentsia, to crush Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian nationalism, because it was an annoyance to the Soviet regime. So when does a kind of Ukrainian national feeling begin to emerge?
Yes, that's true what Robert Conquest was saying, except that one should add this was not just to eliminate Ukrainian national identity, but it was to eliminate any national identity, including the Russian one. The Russian nationalists were all shot. They were all moved. I mean, that's the point. Stalin wanted a personal dictatorship that he called Bolshevik, but actually he executed all the Bolsheviks. And he wanted to smash anybody who had any potential of thinking otherwise. And when in my book, I cite the Stalin's orders of 1937, and what's amazing is that just about every month there was an attack on some national minority. There would be a list, execute all these Latvians and all these Koreans and all the Finnish ones and all the Estonians and all the Ukrainians and all the Russian ones. In other words, it didn't make any difference to Stalin whether it was Ukrainian. The Ukrainians think that the only thing that matters is Ukrainians were attacked. But it was a whole lot of other ones, all just about down the list. And I have the list in my book. In other words, for Stalin, anybody who had any idea of being separate or different and could pose any danger was to be eliminated. So, yeah, and from that point of view, it's not just the Ukrainians.
What can you tell us, before I get into immediate current events, about the Crimea, the Donbass region that has been the source of much contention? The West is, or let's say Western press says one thing and the Russians say another. And again, the average person is left trying to figure out what's correct.
Yeah. Now, if we look at history, and again, in my chapter in the book on the Civil War, this is before these territories were given to Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic by Comrade Lenin. The areas around the Don, which is Donbass, they were the territories of the Cossacks who called themselves the Cossack Free Assembly. They had their own government. They had their own autonomy that they received back from Catherine II. And during the Civil War, they rose in rebellion against the Bolsheviks. And I read their proceedings in their parliament and so forth. They wanted to establish friendly relations with the autonomous Ukrainian Republic. In other words, if somebody told them you are Ukrainian, they would have thought this is crazy. It just doesn't make any sense. They are Cossacks of the Don who fought against the communists just like the Ukrainian nationalists, and they wanted to have friendly relations with the Ukrainians, but they were not Ukrainians. Now, once the Bolsheviks finished them off, and this is another bloody chapter of the Russian Civil War, the so-called de-Kossakization, when they executed en masse these Cossacks and their leaders because they posed a real threat to the Bolsheviks, they gave those lands to Ukraine. And then that was not enough. They thought that they have to control Ukraine, and for that reason, they proclaimed the capital of Ukraine, Kharkov, which was a completely Russian city, had never had any connection to Ukraine. But in order to control Ukraine, because there were no communists in Ukraine, so the only way to control them is to add some Russian workers from Kharkov. I think you disappeared now. Now you're back. So this is how Kharkov wound up in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This is how the Don Cossacks wound up in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And he created that new entity within the USSR that had huge areas that people didn't think they were Ukrainian, didn't speak Ukrainian, and had always had different identification and different tradition, such as Donbass and Kharkov and Odessa too. Odessa is a totally Russian city. And even when there was a nationalist government in Ukraine during the Civil War, they did not claim Odessa as part of Ukraine. They didn't. They just never thought of it as a part of Ukraine. But after 70-some years of Soviet rule, since it was a Soviet Socialist Republic, when the USSR broke up, these territories, including Crimea, wound up in Ukraine.
Hey, folks, you don't exactly have to be a libertarian to realize there is something wrong with the American medical insurance system. It's expensive and getting more and more so. It's confusing. It's opaque. You get a lot of unpleasant surprises, and you feel taken advantage of. So that's why you have Crowd Health. Crowd Health is an alternative way to pay for healthcare through crowdfunding. I was pleasantly surprised to find that folks in my business mastermind, the cream of the crop I have in the Tom Woods Show audience, are using Crowd Health. One of them said at our most recent meeting, my wife had hip replacement surgery and it cost me $500 and that was the end of it. So how does it work? For $175 for an individual or $575 for a family of 4 or more, you'll get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. You'll get access to telemedicine visits, discounted prescriptions, and so much more. And you don't have to worry about doctors' networks either. And you'll join the crowd, a group of members just like you who want to help pay for each other's unexpected medical events. Well, let Crowd Health help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months. Go to joincrowdhealth.com/woods. Crowd Health is not insurance. Learn more at joincrowdhealth.com/woods. That's joincrowdhealth.com/woods. So, now you and I we'll do a separate episode on Putin as a historical figure, but obviously he figures into this question. So when he makes claims about these obviously Russian enclaves in Ukraine, everybody says that that's just self-serving and he has further imperial ambitions beyond that, and that his claim shouldn't be taken seriously. What's the right and wrong of that?
Well, here's the thing. When the Soviet Union broke up, and the reason it broke up is because the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus got together in a forest, Belovesh forest, in November 91, and they signed a paper that they walk out of the Soviet Union. So they finished off the Soviet Union, all three of them. From the point of view of international relations, the independence of Ukraine is a result of an agreement with Russia that both of them walk out of the Soviet Union. And the expectation was that they would be friendly nations living together in harmony, sharing not only borders, they obliged themselves to have open borders, paying pensions, complete freedom of citizenry moving between those three republics. It was supposed to be like a confederation. And Russia didn't object. They said, well, who cares if it's open borders? Let's just decide the status of the Black Sea. And there was a lot of goodwill on both sides, and they did decide the status of the Black Sea. Crimea would be still considered Ukraine, even though it was only given to Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954. But they divided the Crimean, they divided the fleet between different ships going to each country. Russian base in Sevastopol would continue to be as a Russian fleet in Ukraine, but we are all friends, we're brothers, we will continue to have open borders and trade, and that's the way it was supposed to be. And this is why Putin didn't object when he became president, because what's to object to? We have, open borders, we have economic interdependency, we have an oil pipeline that goes through Ukrainian territory, we benefit from it. The situation changed and the rhetoric changed after the 2014 coup d'etat. Now, some people call it Maidan Revolution, some people call it coup d'etat, whatever you call it, the political situation changed dramatically. The pro-Russian government was out, pro-Western government was in, the one that was immediately from the first days controlled by the State Department, by American advisors who accompanied Yatsenyuk and others from the very first days. Now, the people in Donbass say that this is Putin's biggest mistake. They say, that's not me who say, they say that Putin actually lost the nerve and he should have opposed more vigorously, and not just in Crimea, but in Donbass as well. They accuse him of actually not defending them at the time when they needed it, which is in spring 2015. But that's a separate matter. But to explain your question is that it only became a matter of importance when political power in Kiev changed. Then it became important. Well, what about Ukraine? What about Crimea? What about Donbass? What about Kharkov? What about Odessa? They remembered that these are Russian areas, and they were given by Lenin and Stalin to Ukraine, and that's when it became a kind of a politically tense issue. How it's going to be resolved? Because if it continued to be friendly, open border like U.S. and Canada, then you don't care that is a border. Okay, there is a border, but it doesn't affect very good neighborly relations between U.S. and Canada. One expected the same from Ukraine and Russia, but it didn't work out that way.
Well, another thing we hear in the West is that concerns about Ukraine joining NATO are misplaced, and some of the reason that that's misplaced is that that's supposedly never going to happen. That's what they say, but now they seem to be saying the opposite. But another reason that it's no reason to be concerned is that the West has peaceful intentions. What possible reason could there be to be concerned if Ukraine's a member of NATO when NATO has no aggressive designs on Russia? So,
yes,
you think that's legitimate?
That sounds very nice. No, I think that Putin's claim here is quite legitimate and not the other way around, because membership of NATO, if it were only a theoretical guarantee of the United States that if the country is attacked, the United States would defend it, if it was just that, then perhaps one could live with it. But what is really happening in all the newly countries that became NATO after 1997 is that it was a matter of stationing United States missiles and offensive weapons. This is what happened in Poland. This is what happened in Romania. Hungary is now putting a break on it. But I remember when I was going there for all kinds of conferences in the year 2000, it was FBI headquarters and CIA headquarters and whatnot is all housed in Budapest. So Ukraine became de facto member of NATO. In Ochakov, the port, there was a British port facilities built. And now we know that there were United States labs built. And now we know that there were all kinds of military facilities in Ukraine. Now, from Putin's point of view, Ukraine was de facto taken over by NATO as a military, with its military installations, which was a direct threat to the security of Russia. And people around Putin were saying, look, you got to do something because we don't want to find one day that there are missiles in Kharkov, 400 kilometers from Moscow, that now it's a NATO country and has full-fledged American missiles in it. That's unacceptable. So my point to your listeners is, if it was not Putin, somebody else would have put the brake too. Any Russian president cannot accept American missiles in Kharkov, just as America didn't want to accept Russian missiles in Havana.
How do you assess the state of things we're recording this in the middle of May 2024. Well, we've heard a number of times what is almost certainly wishful thinking, but reports in Western sources saying that the Ukrainians are winning, but they'll sometimes say, but they won't continue winning if the U.S. aid isn't forthcoming. What's your assessment of where things are?
My assessment is I'm watching Russian press very attentively, just about every day, and the Ukrainian press and all the channels, Telegram channels, and commentators and so on. What I see happening is much more resolve in Russian leadership, including Putin. Much more resolve. I write in my book in the last chapter on Putin, and the last 10 pages are on Ukraine war. What I write there is that Putin never identified war aims. He never mentions whether Odessa will be Russian, whether Kharkov would be Russian. And that I wrote that in 2023. Now we're in May 24. What I see is that there's a much more resolve to proceed. Now, how far to proceed is still not clear, but it's definitely much more acceptance that Russian-speaking areas such as Kharkov and Odessa will be Russian. Now, where the border would lie is not clear. There are speculations as to. It all depends actually on Western willingness to negotiate. If Biden asked my advice, I would tell him, if you want to have a big chunk of Ukraine independent, make it neutral and sign the deal now. Because the longer they wait, the more territory will be overrun by the Russian army, and the more intransigent their position would be. Because the more the West resists and says, oh, Ukraine will win, we're going to give them more weapons, we're going to give them more weapons. Every time the United States says we're going to give weapons to the Russians, it appears like a red flag to a bull. They want to give them weapons so that they hit Russian territory, so that more Russian people die. Well, we're not going to go negotiate. We're going to march all the way to Kiev and make unconditional capitulation. So the point is, if the deal is possible, it is possible now, before Kiev is taken. If the West procrastinates, no amount of missiles are going to be able to make Ukrainians win. It's only going to anger Russians more. Every missile that hits the Russian territory makes them more intransigent. And that would mean that they would send the army all the way to Kiev and maybe even to Lvov, or as Ukrainians say, Lviv. That's the point. The longer the war lasts, the more territory Russians are going to take.
Can you then, because you're following the media in both places, say something about the state of domestic affairs in Ukraine and the position of Zelensky these days?
Yes. Yeah, I followed with great interest because it's fascinating to watch what's going on, and it's difficult because there's a serious censorship in Ukraine, and nobody's allowed to make reports in areas hit by Russian missiles or from the front line or anything. But what is clear is that the Ukrainians have a very hard time maintaining the draft. And Ukrainian men are just running as fast as they can and hide in different places. Some of them are trying to go abroad. Others are just lying low in villages, being covered by. They don't want to die because the casualty rate. Look, modern war is not for people who are just drafted and thrown into the battle. You have to have skills. It's a very sophisticated machinery that one has to know how to use, and the draftees really don't. So in any way, Russian army is a much more professional army, and it consists of people who volunteered, who are paid well, who are trained well before they put into action. And therefore, and Putin constantly repeats, I hear it yesterday too, with minimal amount of casualties. So they're going slowly in order to preserve soldiers' lives. Zelensky is much less concerned about that. He's concerned of getting money from the West and getting weapons from the West. But weapons have to be serviced. They have to be, especially from various countries, from various systems. You have to have the training. You have to have desire to fight. And that is actually declining in Ukraine. They have a hard time doing the draft. There are a lot of people who just hiding or surrendering if they have a chance to the Russians. Yesterday, I heard that several platoons just surrendered in the neighborhood of Kharkiv, the new front that was open. 150 men just went to the Russians and surrendered. So he's also a big problem with Zelensky is with Zaluzhny, the general who criticized him, who is popular, who has different visions of how to fight the war, and that creates problems for Zelensky. And then his biggest mistake is that he refused to have elections. So on May 21, his term expires. And the Russians have already announced they do not recognize Ukrainian government after May 21, and Zelensky personally, because he's no longer legitimate. So that's a big problem, because if Biden is defending democracy in Ukraine, well, sorry, this president has no longer credentials to be an elected leader. So that's the problem for Ukrainians now.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. And of course, you know I've been talking a lot about monetary metals, which is a service for people smart enough to know they need to own some gold, but who also are ambitious enough to want to see that gold grow. And with monetary metals, you can earn interest on your gold paid in gold. And we have here a monetary metals client. David, why monetary metals? What value does it bring you?
Well, Tom, I started investing in gold probably about 7 or 8 years ago, and I was listening to your podcast. You had mentioned monetary metals, and I ran the numbers, and I realized that the earnings or gains I could have had on that gold, not just in terms of earning more gold, but even looking at just the dollar value, was half of what it could have been. So by being able to earn that interest in gold on gold has allowed me to start maximizing my returns long term while also having the benefit of the safety net of earning gold, especially in such a high inflationary environment.
Well, David, that is exactly how I myself feel, which is why I also have an account at Monetary Metals. So find out more at monetary-metals.com/woods. That's monetary-metals.com/woods. And we think, there were elections, England had elections during World War II. It is possible. It's not like we're asking for anything wildly unusual. So
Putin had elections in March and he won.
Now, given in light of the censorship you mentioned, is there a way, nevertheless, to assess the state of public opinion in Ukraine and how it may have evolved over the past couple of years?
It's very hard, but I have a feeling that the Ukrainians, this is my gut feeling, that the Ukrainians are tired of the war. And many of them think whichever way, as long as it ends, that would be the best. They don't care anymore. In other words, the West has to understand that coming of the Russians is not like coming of the Germans. The people in Mariupol, they have their houses rebuilt and their apartments rebuilt. It's not a catastrophe. Maybe they feel, it's better to have an independent Ukrainian republic. It's preferable. But if worse comes to worse and the Russians come, well, they're not going to be enslaved. They're not going to be bombed. They're not going to be put in the concentration camps. They're going to be back like in the Soviet Union. They're going to be, with whatever measure of autonomy, they will live back again in a Soviet Russian state. In other words, they don't fear it. Some are eagerly waiting. Others don't want to have it, and they move to the western parts of Ukraine because they fear that they fear their identity would be, submerged, or that they've served Ukrainian military and they're afraid of reprisals or whatever. But the majority, it seems to me, are simply tired of the war and would like it to end in whatever way is possible. If peace was signed, I guess most of them would be delighted, and that would be the best thing that would happen. If war has to go on, they put up with this, but they don't like it.
Now, by contrast, can we determine the state of public opinion in Russia about the conflict?
Again, it's very difficult because I hear a lot of critical voices, people that I know, friends and others in Russia. They're critical. They are objecting to Putin's kind of concentrating of powers and crushing any real opposition if it were to emerge. And that's understandable because he is afraid of CIA penetration and recruitment of dissidents and others. But the overall mood in Moscow or in Russia generally is very patriotic. And I don't think it's Putin's propaganda that makes it. I think it's Western weapons. In one of my videos, I wrote, if you show a German tank with the German crosses now in today's Ukraine, Panzer, moving against Russian positions, this image is enough to generate hundreds of volunteers, because the image of German tanks in Ukraine one more time attacking Russia is just, it's just the best thing you could have to create patriotic fever. And that's what's happening. They show in the news how the Germany delivers tanks, and then the Abrams tanks, and so there's a kind of connection in people's minds. The Abrams tanks, American tanks, German tanks, they are attacking Russia. Then they show American missiles that can hit 500 kilometers. Then they show explosions here and there that were launched by Ukrainians with American missiles. I mean, that generates anger against the West, against the Ukrainians, big time anger against the Germans. Some people are saying that why did we let them go? We should have stayed there, or we should have destroyed Berlin in a way that it would never recover. There's tremendous anger against the West. And then this patriotic fever that you have, so many volunteers, like they say, tens of thousands of volunteering all the time, that they don't need any mobilization in Russia because there's so many volunteers. And they're doing a very good job of not throwing them into battle. They take months in training them, and they stay in reserve, and the draftees are never sent to the front. And the new Minister of Defense, I heard him today on the radio. He said that they will take great care of financial support for the relatives and for those who serve. In other words, it's a very well organized campaign. But the biggest drive of Russian enthusiasm for the army is American military equipment that you could see with your own eyes in the fields of Ukraine.
The video you made on your YouTube channel that I noticed that is what prompted me to get in contact with you, centered around the question, why does the West hate Russia? And when we say the West, I think by and large we mean the political elites of the West, who appear to be absolutely obsessed, just obsessed with their hatred of Russia that seems vastly out of proportion to any real threat from Russia. And so it demands explanation. And of course, in American society, if you so much as suggest that the situation in Ukraine might be slightly more complicated than Hillary Clinton thinks, then you are accused of being a lackey of the Russians. It is wild. You cannot have a conversation with these people. And you wanted to try to figure out what is the source of this. And what was the answer you came up with?
Well, the answer that I gave is a very short answer, which is that the American elite hates the Russians because Putin made Russia great again. But if we think deeper about this, why should American elite feel threatened if Russia becomes great? What's the problem? Why couldn't there be a great Russia? Why couldn't it be a Russia that is prosperous, that is getting richer, that has more technologies? Why does America have to feel threatened by rich and prosperous Russia? The Chinese are developing, and yet nobody seems to think that it has to be stopped or destroyed or whatever. There are people who are beginning to worry. But if you get back to the Russian question, I received so many comments, you wouldn't believe it. It was like I was spending hours and hours responding to people to that video, and they started suggesting their own explanations. Some people started suggesting that Russia had always been a problem for Anglo-American domination of the world. And they go back to the Crimean War of 1853. And some people suggest that it's the this kind of an arrogant claim to superiority that Hillary Clinton voiced. We're number one, we're exceptional nation. And then, comes Russia in about 2007 when Putin made his famous speech at the Munich conference, was saying, wait a second. We don't want to accept everything you say. We're against your invasion of Iraq. We're against your having bases all over the world. Russia will not be a subservient yes man. We have our own interests and we will defend them. And if need be, by force. And that's what really triggered this kind of obsession with Putin interfering in American elections, with Putin doing this, Putin doing that. My personal view is that the beginning of all this is in 2003. And this is what I said in this video. 2003 was the year when the United States invaded Iraq. But it was more important that it is in that context that France, Germany, and Russia, three of them together, opposed this invasion in the United Nations. And that must have been a kind of a very, very scary feeling in Washington. What's going on? we're losing Europe. We're losing Russia and Germany and France may create a kind of a new European home that the Russians dreamed about, and then NATO is irrelevant. Our influence is irrelevant. What's going on? We have to stop it. We have to stop it. And I think that's the turning point. The United States elite got scared that Russian, German, French cooperation would consider. And how do you stop it? Well, they found a way. You rely on countries that didn't like Russia because they suffered from the Soviet Union. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, all these countries that were formerly Soviet bloc, they were recently freed from Soviet domination. So now they pump up their fear of the Russians. And I'm telling them, the Russians are not the same as the Soviets. The communists are enemy of Russia, and they have done more harm to Russia than anybody else. So to equate Russia and the Soviet Union is fundamentally wrong. Post-Soviet Russia was different. And Putin tried to be just going out of his way to be friends with Western leaders. People forget that even George Bush called him a friend. And Prime Minister Berlusconi and Chancellor Schroeder and Chirac, all of them called him a friend. He wanted to continue this normal cooperation with Western powers. There was a lot of investment coming to Russia. It was all going very well until 2007. In 2007, he gave his speech. In 2008, it was decided that NATO would include Ukraine and Georgia. It was an outright provocation. It was a slap in the face. It was saying to Putin, we don't care about your friendship with the French and the Germans. We are going to enlarge NATO, whether you like it or not. This was a declaration of war. That's the first stage of the war. It started with the decision of 2008 to expand NATO to include not just East European countries that Russia had to swallow, but former Soviet republics, Georgia and Ukraine. Russia said, no, that's not acceptable. Who cares? You can say whatever you want. You don't have the power to enforce your dislike. Well, Putin said, okay, we'll show you we've got the power. And he started building these hypersonic missiles. In 2018, he unveiled those and said these missiles can hit the United States. How it was received? The West said, nah, this is all nonsense. They don't have it. Just they're bragging. They don't have any of those. Then it turned out they do. They don't doubt there is an avant-garde missile that can hit any spot in the United States and nobody can stop it. Before they know it on their radars, it hits. So that means that Putin made Russia great again, at least in terms of military capacity to rival the United States. That got them mad even more. And they started thinking how to stop him by provoking Ukraine against Russia. And they started arming Ukraine, arming. And then just today, I heard Ray McGovern, former CIA Russian specialist, who said that it is in January 22 that the United States encouraged Ukraine to increase shelling of Donbass. In other words, they kept on shelling in just many, many times over than the normal rate, provoking the Russians. They made the Russians to shoot back. And as soon as they shot back, they said, aha, it's an invasion. So that's how this war started. It was deliberate setup that Putin got himself into. And many people today think this was a big mistake. He allowed himself to be portrayed as an invader of Ukraine, whereas in fact, he was set up to shoot back at the provocations of the Ukrainians against Donbass.
Well, I want to continue this conversation in the future in another episode on Putin himself and devote an entire conversation just to him. But in the meantime, I will once again recommend, got it right here, your book From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin. I've got it in the description of the video as well as on the show notes page, which is tomwoods.com/2491. And Dr. Brovkin, my thanks to you once again, and I hope we can do this again before too long.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.